The world is home to thousands of ethnic groups, each with their own history, their own culture, and their own DNA. But how different are they really at a genetic level? Today, we're answering that question, using actual genetic distance data to rank every major population on Earth by how far they are from the average Anglo-American. After weeks of running DNA analyses and cross-referencing population genetics research, we've built a complete framework, 7 distinct levels of genetic distance. While some of these levels will make intuitive sense, others might completely change how you think about race. Starting with level 1, Europeans. The closest populations to our Anglo-American sample are, unsurprisingly, other Europeans. From Icelanders to Greeks, European populations fall within this first level of genetic distance. But if all Europeans are this close, what exactly do they have in common at a genetic level? And where does the boundary start to blur? It comes down to 3 ancestral components, and every European carries some mix of all 3. First, the Western hunter-gatherers, the original post-Ice Age inhabitants of the continent, who had been there for thousands of years. Then, around 9,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers migrated from Anatolia, bringing agriculture and largely replacing those hunter-gatherer populations. Finally, about 5,000 years ago, Bronze Age steppe pastoralists swept in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, spreading Indo-European languages with them. Now, the proportions do vary, and they shift mostly along a north-south gradient. Northern Europeans tend to carry more steppe ancestry, while Southern Europeans are more heavily farmer-derived. The further south and east you go, the more you approach the boundary. Populations such as Sicilians, Greek Islanders, or Ashkenazi Jews might have formed in Europe, but they're starting to pull towards something else. They carry ancestry that connects them to people beyond this continent, populations that make up our next level. Level 2, Other West Eurasians. Step outside of Europe and you enter the broader West Eurasian world. Anatolian Turks, Kurds, Persians, Levantines, Arabs, Caucasian peoples, and North Africans. Noticeably further than any European, but still far closer than anything to the east. So what separates them from Europeans if they're all part of the same West Eurasian family? The answer is something called basal Eurasian ancestry. This is a lineage that split off from other Eurasians very early, likely somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, before the main Eurasian population had even interbred with Neanderthals. That last part is key, because basal Eurasians diverged before Neanderthal admixture happened. Populations that carry a lot of it tend to have less Neanderthal DNA than Europeans do. Peninsular Arabs can carry up to 45% basal Eurasian ancestry, Iranians around 35%. Europeans have some too. It entered Europe with the Neolithic farmers, but significantly less. This basal Eurasian pull, layered on top of distinct regional histories and thousands of years of local admixture, is what pushes these populations just far enough from Europeans to form their own level. They're part of the same West Eurasian family, built from overlapping ancestral sources, but the proportions are different enough that the distance is real. Now what happens when West Eurasian ancestry is no longer the whole picture, when it starts sharing space with something far more divergent? Level 3, Mixed West Eurasians. This is where it gets more complex. Level 3 includes South Asians, Central Asians, and most Latin Americans, populations that span entirely different continents and histories. Yet on a genetic distance plot, they land at roughly the same distance from our Anglo-American sample. What could populations from Delhi, Bogota, and Tashkent possibly have in common? They're all part West Eurasian, but that's no longer the whole story. Each of these groups carries significant ancestry from deeply divergent non-West Eurasian sources. In South Asians, that's the ancient ancestral South Indian component, a lineage that split from West Eurasians tens of thousands of years ago. In Latin American mestizos, it's indigenous American ancestry. In Central Asians, it's East Eurasian ancestry from steppe and Siberian-related populations. The West Eurasian side also arrived through very different routes. For Latin Americans, European admixture is recent, 500 years at most, a direct result of colonization. For South Asians, it's layered. First came ancestry related to Zagrotian or Iranian plateau farmers, who spread into the subcontinent alongside the adoption of agriculture. Then, thousands of years later, Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, the same component that shaped Europe, arrived with the Indo-European migrations, adding a second wave of West Eurasian ancestry on top. The timing is different, the sources aren't identical, but the result is similar. Populations that sit in between the West Eurasian cluster and something much further away. And that something further away is where Level 4 begins. Level 4, East Eurasians. Now we cross the deepest divide within Eurasia. East Asians, Southeast Asian, and Siberians all sit at this level. These are populations with no significant West Eurasian ancestry, separated from our Anglo-American sample by over 40,000 years of independent evolution. But if they've been separate for that long, how did they end up spanning such a massive geographic range, from the Arctic to the Pacific Islands? It goes back to the original split. After the out-of-Africa migration, the ancestral Eurasian population likely sat somewhere around the Iranian plateau before diverging into a western and an eastern branch roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago. The eastern branch pushed through South and Southeast Asia before expanding northward into what is now China, Siberia, and eventually across the Pacific. This single eastern branch, what geneticists call the East and Southeast Asian lineage, would go on to become the primary ancestry source for an enormous range of modern populations. Internally, there's real diversity here. East Asians like the Japanese and Koreans differ from Southern East Asians like Indonesians or Thai people. Siberians carry varying amounts of ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a deeply divergent lineage that also contributed to Europeans and Native Americans. Polynesians are a mix of East Asian ancestry from the Austronesian expansion with local Oceanian ancestry they picked up along the way. But all of these groups still cluster on the East Eurasian side of the global divide. The next level is where we find populations that split off even earlier and had tens of thousands of years of near total isolation on top of it. Level 5. Divergent non-Africans. This is where the distances start to get extreme. Level 5 includes some of the most isolated populations on Earth, Australian Aboriginals and non-admixed Indigenous Americans, like those of the deep Amazon. These groups sit beyond East Asians in genetic distance from our Anglo-American sample. So what makes them more distant than the populations we just covered in the previous level? Two things: early divergence and prolonged isolation. Australian Aboriginals descend from one of the earliest branches of the out-of-Africa expansion. They reached Australia roughly 50,000 years ago, and then remained almost completely cut off from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. That's an extraordinary amount of time for independent genetic drift to accumulate. Indigenous Americans followed a different path but ended up in a similar situation. Their ancestors crossed from Siberia into the Americas via Beringia, went through a severe population bottleneck, and then diversified in near total isolation from the Old World. The groups that remained unadmixed, particularly deep Amazonian populations, show genetic distances that reflect that long separation. What unites this level is the combination of deep divergence time and extreme geographic isolation. These populations split early and stayed separate, and yet they're still not the most distant populations from our Anglo-American baseline. That distinction belongs to the next two levels, which take us into Africa and the deepest branches of the human family tree. Level 6. Niger-Congo Africans. This level covers the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africa, West Africans, Central Africans, and Bantu-speaking populations stretching from East to Southern Africa. But why would they be so distant from non-Africans? When Africa is where all of humanity originated, the answer is the out-of-Africa bottleneck. When a small group of humans left Africa somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago, they carried only a fraction of the continent's total genetic diversity with them. Every non-African population on Earth, Europeans, East Asians, Aboriginals, Amerindians, descends from that small founding group. Over tens of thousands of years, drift and divergence widened the gap between the populations that left and the populations that stayed. Within this level, populations are actually quite closely related to each other. The Bantu expansion, one of the most successful demographic events in human history, spread a relatively homogeneous set of populations across most of sub-Saharan Africa over the last few thousand years. A Yoruba from Nigeria and a Zulu from South Africa are far more similar to each other than either is to our Anglo-American sample. But even Niger-Congo Africans aren't the most distant populations from Europeans. There are groups within Africa that diverged far earlier, groups that represent the very deepest branches of the human family tree. Level 7. Divergent Sub-Saharan Africans. We've reached the final level, made up of very special African populations, the Khoisan foragers of southern Africa and the Central African pygmy groups like the Mbuti and Baka. But what makes them more distant than the Niger-Congo Africans we just covered? When they live on the same continent, the Khoisan are the deepest branch. Their lineage split from the rest of humanity somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, making it the oldest known divergence in modern human phylogeny. Every other living population, all Europeans, all East Asians, all Niger-Congo Africans, sits on the other side of that split. The Khoisan were first. The pygmy groups diverged later, roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, from the ancestors of Niger-Congo populations. That's more recent than the Khoisan split, but still ancient, and deep enough to place them well beyond the Niger-Congo level in genetic distance. Their long isolation in the Central African rainforest, combined with strong population bottlenecks, pushed them further out. What these groups share is what came after, the Bantu expansion. Before it swept across sub-Saharan Africa, the Khoisan ranged across much of southern and eastern Africa, and pygmy groups occupied vast stretches of the Central African forest belt. Both were gradually displaced or absorbed. Today they survive in small, isolated pockets, carrying DNA that predates every migration, every empire, and every civilization that came after them.